The first human ship to cross the Harath fold did not announce itself with flares or prayers or the neat symmetry of alien expectation. It arrived sideways in every sense that mattered, shedding radiation like a wounded animal and dragging a wake of distorted time that made the instruments of the observing stations argue with one another. To the watchers, who had measured the universe in patient curves and predictable tides for longer than human history could remember itself, the vessel appeared less like a triumph of engineering and more like a bruise on reality, a moving contradiction that insisted on continuing to exist, even as the surrounding equations failed to agree on where it should be. Inside that vessel, nothing felt triumphant. The corridors were narrow, scuffed by generations of boots that had learned to brace for impact before learning to walk straight. The air tasted faintly of metal and recycled water, and the lights flickered with a rhythm that the crew had long since stopped noticing because it never quite crossed the line into failure. Humans were good at living in the space just before things broke. It was not a talent they had chosen, but it was one they had cultivated with an almost stubborn pride. Marrow-Kef moved through the central spine of the ship with a gait that matched the vibration of the hull, compensating without conscious thought for the slight lag that came from the fold's lingering effects. His hair was bound back in a practical tie, already threaded with grey despite his years, and his eyes carried the steady alertness of someone who slept when he could and learned to function when he could not. He paused at a junction where the plating had been replaced so many times that it resembled a patchwork quilt of alloys, each one a memory of a problem that had not quite managed to kill them. The ship was called the Far Hand, a name chosen less for poetry than for accuracy. It had been built far from Earth, far from the industrial cores that still pretended they were the center of humanity, assembled instead in a drifting yard that repurposed wrecks and surplus and whatever else could be coerced into serving one more purpose. The Far Hand had never been meant to be first. It had been meant to be sufficient. Marrow reached the bridge and took his place at the command ring without ceremony. Around him, the crew settled into their tasks, each movement economical, each voice measured. There was no cheering. There were no speeches. The Harath fold lay behind them now, a region of space that bent and twisted like a knot tied by a bored god, and ahead lay a volume of stars that no human had ever seen directly, mapped only by distant observation and theoretical models that came with disclaimers longer than the equations themselves. "Status," Marrow said, his voice calm, carrying just far enough to be heard without needing to be loud. The responses came in sequence, overlapping just enough to save time. Hull integrity was within tolerances, though tolerances had been adjusted again to account for microfractures that refused to propagate in predictable ways. Power generation was stable, though the fold had left an echo that made the reactors hum at a frequency no one could quite tune out. Navigation confirmed position with a margin of error that would have terrified earlier generations and merely annoyed this one. Sensors were the last to report, and the pause before that voice spoke was longer than Marrow liked. "We are not alone," said Ansel Varric, who had been born on a station where the stars were a rumor and had learned to listen to machines like other people listen to weather. Multiple contacts, non-human, distributed array, they were already here. Marrow did not ask how many. Numbers mattered less than intent, and intent was a thing you inferred from patterns, not counts. "Are they reacting?" he asked. "Yes," Ansel said, and there was a note of something like curiosity beneath the professional calm. "They are adjusting observation vectors. They are trying to understand how we arrived." Marrow allowed himself a thin smile. "So are we. The observers belong to no single species. That, too, was a thing humans would come to learn." The civilizations that had grown around the Harath fold had done so in layers, each one building atop the ruins or remnants of the last, adding their own interpretations and technologies to a shared, understanding that the fold was both boundary and opportunity. They had watched it for millennia, cataloging the rare natural phenomena that emerged from its depths and the even rarer artificial constructs that sometimes failed to survive the passage. Nothing like the far hand had ever come through intact. On a structure that was less a station than a carefully balanced ecosystem of habitats and sensor nodes, a being called Tathran of Long Measure adjusted its focus. Tathran's form was an arrangement of articulated segments that could have been mistaken for sculpture by a human eye, each surface etched with patterns that recorded time as texture. Tathran had been old when the first of its kind had noticed the fold's irregularities, and age had only sharpened its patience. "This is not a transient," Tathran communicated to the others, its thoughts translated through layers of convention and compromise into a shared analytical space. "This is a constructed entity. Its internal processes are inefficient. Its external profile is inelegant." "That is not a disqualifying trait," responded Keschel, whose species had once been dismissed for similar reasons before proving that elegance was not the sole path to survival. "Observe the coherence. It persists. It persists because it forces persistence," said another voice, cooler, more distant. "The fold should have shredded it. And yet it did not," Keschel replied. "We must update our assumptions. Assumptions were the currency of the region. The civilizations here traded in them, tested them, refined them, and discarded them when they failed. It was how they had avoided stagnation in a cosmos that rewarded complacency with extinction. The human ship did not broadcast immediately. That, too, was unexpected. Most first contacts came wrapped in cautious signals, mathematical introductions, declarations of peaceful intent. The far hand did none of these things. It oriented itself, stabilized its trajectory, and began deploying sensor drones with the air of someone unpacking after a long journey. Marrow watched the data streams populate his displays, each new contact tagged, cross-referenced, and evaluated. The unknown had a way of becoming manageable once you gave it a label and a probability distribution. He had learned that lesson early, growing up on a colony where the ground itself had once tried to kill them by forgetting how to be solid. "Any signs of hostility?" he asked. "None detected," Ansel said, "but they are watching us watch them." "Fair," Marrow said. "We would do the same." He leaned back slightly, feeling the hum of the ship through the command chair. This was the moment he had rehearsed in his mind so many times that it had lost its sharpness. Humanity's first step into a wider community, if community was the right word. There were protocols, of course, hammered out over decades of argument and compromise. There were statements prepared, translations ready to be attempted, gestures designed to communicate openness without vulnerability. Marrow did not use them, not yet. "Hold broadcasts," he said. "Continue passive observation. Let them decide when they are done staring." On the observation structure, Tathran considered this choice with interest. "They do not announce themselves," it noted. "They do not request acknowledgement. Perhaps they assume acknowledgement is inevitable," Keschel suggested. "Or perhaps they do not care whether we acknowledge them," said the cooler voice. "That would be novel. Time passed, measured differently by each species present. For humans, it was minutes and hours, the familiar cadence of shifts and checks. For others, it was cycles of biochemical readiness or the slow drift of thought across distributed neural substrates. The far hand continued its work, mapping, calibrating, adapting. It sent drones toward phenomena that the observers had long ago deemed uninteresting, probing gravitational eddies and radiation gradients with an intensity that suggested desperation or curiosity in equal measure. "Why are they so focused on the margins?" Keschel asked. "Because that is where they live," Tathran replied after a moment's consideration. "Look at their vessel. It is not optimized. It is resilient." Resilience was a concept the observers understood, but humans embodied it in a way that felt almost aggressive. The far hand was a compromise made physical, a collection of solutions that had been good enough at the time and were now being asked to be good enough again. Its crew carried the same philosophy in their bodies, scarred and adapted, each one a testament to survival achieved without perfection. When the first broadcast finally came, it was simple. No flourish, no grand declaration. A tight beam of structured data that carried mathematical constants, physical measurements, and a map of the immediate region annotated with human interpretations. It did not say hello. It said, "This is how we see." The observers parsed it with care. There were inefficiencies, redundancies, assumptions that betrayed a limited sensorium, and a history of making do with partial information. There was also a startling clarity of purpose. The humans were not trying to impress, they were trying to be understood. "They are offering a perspective," Keschel said, "not a plea, and not a threat," Tathrin added. "They assume parity. Parity they have not earned," came the cool reply. "Parity they may redefine," Keschel countered. On the far hand, Marrow watched as the returns began to shift. The observers responded in kind, sending back their own data sets, their own maps and constants, layered with translation scaffolds that acknowledged the differences without apologizing for them. It was a conversation conducted in numbers and patterns, a negotiation of reality itself. "Captain," Ansel said quietly, "they are sharing more than expected." Marrow nodded. "So are we." He knew the risks. Information was leverage, and humanity had precious little leverage to spare. But he also knew that hiding behind caution had never been their strength. Humans advanced by stepping into uncertainty and refusing to retreat when it pushed back. As the exchange deepened, something else emerged. The observers began to ask questions, not in the direct way humans favored, but through the gaps in their data, the anomalies they highlighted, the regions of parameter space they seemed to circle with particular interest. They wanted to know how the far hand had survived the fold. They wanted to know what methods had been used, what principles had been bent or broken. Marrow authorized the release of the relevant sections, complete with notes and caveats. He did not sanitize the failures. He included the near misses, the patches and workarounds, the moments when someone had made a decision based on intuition and stubborn hope rather than elegant theory. "This will not reflect well on us," Ansel said. "It reflects us," Marrow replied. "That will have to be enough." Tathrin absorbed the data with something like awe. The human approach to the fold was not a single solution, but a cascade of adaptations, each one responding to a problem that had not existed until the moment before. Where others sought to model the fold into submission, humans had thrown themselves into it and learned by surviving. "They do not conquer phenomena," Tathrin said. "They endure them. And in enduring, they learn things we have missed," Keschel added. The cool voice was silent for a long time. When it spoke again, there was a subtle shift. "We must reassess our security assumptions." That, more than any welcome, marked the true beginning. On the far hand, the crew settled into a new rhythm, one that included the presence of watching minds and the slow construction of mutual understanding. Marrow stood at the edge of the bridge, looking out at a starfield that felt suddenly closer, as if the universe had leaned in to listen. Humanity had arrived not with perfection or power, but with persistence and a willingness to share the cost of it. In a region of space that had long believed it, had seen every way a civilization could rise or fall, that simple fact was enough to bend expectations, if not yet reality. The far hand continued forward, carrying with it the accumulated weight of uncounted days, and the observers watched, no longer certain whether they were witnessing an anomaly or the opening of a chapter they had never imagined themselves part of. The observers did not sleep, but they did pause. In the layered habitats around the Hareth fold, cycles of attention shifted, resources reallocated, long-standing models quietly amended. The arrival of the far hand had introduced not chaos, but friction, the productive kind that generated heat and light rather than rupture. For the first time in many generations, The region's shared analytical frameworks included a variable that could not be smoothed away by increased resolution or longer observation. Humans. On the far hand, the crew felt the change as a subtle tightening of the air. No alarms sounded, no hostile signatures appeared on the displays, but the data flow thickened, grew denser with inquiry. The observers were no longer content with watching how the ship moved through space. They wanted to know how it moved through decision. They probed response times, command hierarchies, error correction protocols. They asked, indirectly and relentlessly, who was in charge and why. Maro Kef noticed first when the translation layer flagged an unusual pattern. The observers had begun correlating his biometric data with command outcomes, mapping his presence on the bridge against shifts in ship behavior. It was not invasive in the way human surveillance could be invasive, but it was thorough, and it carried an implicit question. "They are trying to locate authority," Ansel said, his fingers dancing over the interface as he tracked the pattern's evolution. "They do not understand why so many decisions route through you when others could execute them faster." Maro exhaled slowly. "They assume optimization is the goal." "It often is," Ansel replied. "Not always," Maro said. "Sometimes continuity matters more." He authorized the release of command structure documentation, stripped of sensitive tactical details, but honest about the distributed nature of authority aboard the Far Hand. The observers would see that while Maro held final responsibility, the ship functioned through a web of delegated judgment, each crew member empowered to act within broad parameters when delay meant death. The response was immediate and telling. The observers highlighted inconsistencies, moments where protocol had been overridden by individual choice. They asked why these deviations had not been punished, why systems had not been redesigned to prevent recurrence. Maro dictated the reply himself. He did not soften the words. "Because the deviations kept us alive," the message conveyed. "Because no system anticipates every condition. Because trust in people is sometimes a more robust solution than control over them." Tathran of Long Measure lingered over that response, its textured surfaces registering the passage of subjective time as fine gradations in pattern. "They accept unpredictability," it communicated to the others. "They incorporate it." "That is inefficient," the cool voice observed. "It is adaptive," Keschel countered. "Efficiency assumes a stable environment, and this region is stable," the cool voice said. "Until it is not," Keschel replied. "The fold itself is evidence of that." Beyond philosophy, practical consequences began to emerge. The observers controlled access to resources humanity did not yet possess. Navigational corridors through relativistically unstable regions, energy extraction methods that skirted the edge of known physics, early warning networks tuned to phenomena that could erase a ship before its crew registered danger. None of these were offered outright, but neither were they withheld. Instead, the observers began to construct scenarios, simulated challenges that mirrored real threats in the region, and invited the Far Hand to respond. The first scenario was simple by their standards: a modeled gravitic shear, the kind that tore apart poorly braced structures and sent even well-designed vessels tumbling into catastrophic resonance. The observers presented it as data, a hypothetical projection of what lay ahead along one of the Far Hand's potential trajectories. Ansel studied it, brow furrowed. "By our models, we cannot pass through this intact," he said. "The shear frequency aligns with our hull's weakest harmonics." Maro nodded. "By their models, what happens?" "They assume we reroute," Ansel said, "or we fail." Maro considered that. The Far Hand had rerouted before, taken longer paths to avoid unacceptable risk. But time was a resource too, and the observers were watching not just what choice was made, but how. "Run our own simulation," Maro said. "Full fidelity, include structural damping modifications." Ansel hesitated. "Those modifications are untested." "So was the fold," Maro replied. The crew worked with practiced intensity, feeding data into models that had been patched and repatched over the years, each layer a compromise between accuracy and computational feasibility. They did not achieve elegance. They achieved possibility. The resulting projection showed damage, significant damage, but survivable. Systems would fail. Compartments would be lost. But the ship would emerge on the other side. Marrow authorized transmission of the simulation, complete with damage estimates and contingency plans. He added a note. "We would proceed," it said, "because the alternative cost is higher." The observers' reaction rippled through their shared space. Tathran recorded a rare deviation in its internal rhythms. "They accept harm as a variable," it said, "not as an endpoint, and they plan for recovery rather than avoidance," Keschel added. The cool voice was silent again, longer this time. The observers responded with an updated scenario, more complex, layering multiple threats in sequence. Radiation storms, sensor occlusion, hostile unknowns. Each time, the far hand answered not with denial of risk, but with adaptation, showing how systems could be reconfigured, how crew could compensate for lost automation, how redundancy could be created on the fly by repurposing components never meant for that role. It was not flawless. In one scenario, the human solution resulted in the simulated loss of a third of the crew. The observers flagged this as unacceptable, a failure state that should invalidate the approach. Marrow's reply was stark. "Loss is unacceptable," it said, "but it is sometimes unavoidable. Planning that assumes zero loss produces brittle systems. We plan to survive the loss and continue." That answer unsettled them more than any technical improvisation. The observers had evolved cultures and technologies designed to minimize individual sacrifice, often by removing individuals from the most dangerous loops altogether. Humanity's willingness to place itself directly in harm's way, not as a last resort, but as a foundational assumption, challenged deeply held premises. Tathran revisited ancient records, patterns etched into its own form that recalled species long gone. "There have been others," it said slowly, "not like this, but similar in spirit. They burned brightly, they did not last. Those species sought domination," Keschel replied, "or transcendence. These humans seek continuation." "Continuation at what cost?" the cool voice asked. Keschel did not answer immediately. When it did, the response was careful. "At a cost they are willing to pay themselves." As the days passed, the far hand moved deeper into the region, escorted not by ships, but by attention. The observers adjusted local conditions subtly, smoothing some instabilities, allowing others to manifest, watching how the human vessel responded. It was a test, though not an overtly hostile one, and Marrow knew it. "They are shaping the environment," Ansel said, "not to hurt us, to see us." Marrow leaned against the console, feeling the ship's vibration shift as it compensated for a minor perturbation that had not existed moments before. "We do the same to each other," he said. "This is how trust begins." Trust, however, was not universal. On one of the more distant observer habitats, a faction that rarely engaged directly began to mobilize. They were not a unified species so much as a coalition of interests bound by a shared conclusion that the arrival of humans represented an unacceptable variable. They communicated through encrypted channels, their discourse sharp and efficient. The far hand's survival of the fold, its adaptive responses, its apparent indifference to loss, all pointed to a potential threat not of immediate violence, but of long-term destabilization. Humans did not fit cleanly into existing hierarchies or predictive models. They were too flexible, too willing to operate in regimes others avoided. Such entities spread, one analyst argued. They normalize risk. They encourage others to attempt what should not be attempted. And in doing so, another replied, they erode the barriers that protect us all. The coalition's proposal was cautious, framed as a protective measure rather than an act of aggression. They suggested isolating the far hand, limiting its access to shared resources, perhaps even guiding it back toward the fold under controlled conditions. Not destruction, Containment. The idea circulated, gaining traction among those who valued stability above all else. It did not yet reach consensus, but it moved closer with each demonstration of human adaptability. Tathran sensed the shift like a change in gravity. It reviewed the coalition's arguments, weighing them against its own observations. Containment may provoke escalation, it warned. These humans respond poorly to perceived confinement. That is speculation, came the reply. So is containment, Tathran countered. We are all extrapolating from limited data. Keschel aligned with Tathran, its own experience with marginalization informing its stance. They have not yet shown hostility, it argued. They have shown transparency. That should count for something. The cool voice, which had begun to function as an informal arbiter, finally spoke. We will not act precipitously, continue observation, increase engagement. Engagement took a new form shortly thereafter. The observers initiated a direct conceptual exchange, requesting a human presence within their shared analytical space. Not a physical transfer, which would have been impractical, but a mediated interface that allowed for near real-time exchange of intent and reasoning. Ansel brought the request to Marrow with a mixture of excitement and concern. They want you, he said, specifically. Marrow raised an eyebrow. Authority again. Or accountability, Ansel said. Marrow considered the risks. Direct engagement meant exposure, not just of data, but of mindset. It meant opening himself to scrutiny by intelligences that had evolved along entirely different paths, whose assumptions about self and society might clash violently with his own. It also meant opportunity. Set it up, Marrow said, with safeguards. The interface was not a room or a screen, but a state, a carefully constructed overlap between human cognition and the observer's shared space. When Marrow entered it, he felt a pressure behind his eyes, a sense of expansion constrained by unfamiliar boundaries. Concepts flowed not as words, but as structured impressions, each one tagged with context and probability. He did not see Tathran or Keschel as forms. He perceived them as presences, patterns of emphasis and priority. The cool voice was there too. Its influence felt more than heard. You are the locus of decision, the shared space conveyed. I am a node, Marrow replied, shaping his thoughts deliberately, one among many, yet outcomes correlate with you, came the response. Responsibility does, Marrow said. That is not the same as control. The exchange unfolded slowly, cautiously. The observers probed Marrow's values, his tolerance for uncertainty, his perception of humanity's place in the cosmos. They asked why humans ventured outward when their own systems remained fragile, why they did not consolidate before expanding. Marrow's answers were unvarnished. Because consolidation breeds complacency, he said. Because fragility does not disappear if you hide from it. Because we learn by doing, and doing requires exposure. And if exposure leads to extinction, the cool voice pressed. Then we will have learned something, Marrow replied. And if we do not survive to apply it, perhaps others will. That answer reverberated through the shared space. It was not logical by the observer's standards, but it was coherent within a different framework, one that placed value on process as much as outcome. When Marrow disengaged, returning to the familiar confines of the Far Hands Bridge, he felt drained but steady. Ansel watched him closely. Well, Ansel asked. They are not sure what to do with us, Marrow said, which means they are taking us seriously. Outside the Far Hand, the region adjusted again. The coalition's momentum slowed, counterbalanced by new data, new uncertainty. The observers did not yet welcome humanity, but they no longer viewed it as a curiosity. They viewed it as a factor, and factors, once introduced, had a way of changing equations far beyond their initial scope. The first sign that observation had shifted into consequence came not as a threat, but as an absence. The Far Hand's long-range sensors registered a corridor of space ahead that should have been dense with background activity, the low-level churn of particles and fields that marked the region as alive with interaction. Instead, there was a hollow, a volume of relative calm carved, with unnatural precision. Ansel noticed it during a routine sweep and frowned. "This region has been actively damped," he said, "not stabilized, suppressed." Marrow studied the projection. "By whom?" Ansel hesitated. "That is the problem. It does not match any single observer signature. It looks cooperative." Marrow felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. "Containment," he said quietly. "They are building walls without calling them walls." The far hand adjusted course slightly, not enough to appear evasive, but enough to test the edges of the hollow. The ship's instruments responded with confusion, returning contradictory readings, as if reality itself were being encouraged to behave. That more than overt hostility set Marrow's teeth on edge. Humans understood force. They understood threat. Manipulation disguised as benevolence was harder to confront without escalating. "They are trying to make our path easier," Ansel said. "Safer." "On their terms," Marrow replied. The observers did not deny it when the far hand transmitted a query. Their response was careful, framed in the language of risk mitigation and mutual benefit. The region beyond the damped corridor, they explained, contained phenomena that had ended previous exploratory efforts. By guiding the human vessel along a curated route, they reduced the likelihood of catastrophic loss. "It is an offer," Keschel conveyed through the shared channel, "not a command." Marrow took the time to craft his reply, knowing it would be parsed far beyond its surface meaning. "We appreciate the consideration," he said, "but we cannot accept a path that limits our understanding. If we only travel where others have made it safe, we learn only what they have chosen to learn." There was a pause, long enough to signal internal debate among the observers. "The dangers are not trivial," came the response, tinged with something like frustration. "Some knowledge is not worth the cost of acquisition." "That is a value judgment," Marrow replied, "one we cannot outsource." The damped corridor remained, a silent suggestion hanging in space. The far hand did not enter it. Instead, Marrow ordered a course that skirted its boundary, threading a line between compliance and defiance. The ship's hull creaked as it encountered unmanaged turbulence, and warning lights flared briefly before systems compensated. On the observation structures, reactions diverged. Tathranov long measure marked the decision with a deepening of its etched patterns. "They resist soft constraint," it noted. "Predictable and concerning," replied one of the coalition-aligned voices. "They refuse guidance even when it benefits them. They refuse curation," Keschel said. "There is a difference." The cool voice, which had begun to function less as an arbiter and more as a balancing force, remained neutral. "Observe outcomes," it instructed. "Let evidence accumulate." Evidence accumulated quickly. Beyond the damped corridor lay a region where gravitational gradients twisted unpredictably, not violently enough to tear matter apart, but subtly enough to degrade structural integrity over time. The observers had long ago learned to avoid it, marking it as a zone of diminishing returns. The far hand entered it deliberately. Within hours, microfracture alerts began to cascade across the ship's systems. The hull's patchwork nature, once a testament to survival, now became a liability as mismatched alloys responded differently to the shifting stresses. Damage control teams mobilized, sealing compartments, reinforcing weak points with materials never meant for that purpose. Marrow moved among them, not issuing orders so much as absorbing information, lending his presence to moments where morale threatened to falter. He watched as a junior engineer rerouted power through an auxiliary conduit using a solution improvised from half-remembered training and pure necessity. It worked barely. They transmitted the data in real time, not as a boast, but as documentation. The observers watched as humans fought entropy with ingenuity and stubbornness, turning a region deemed unprofitable into a crucible of learning. "They are harvesting failure," Tathran observed. "Each degradation informs future design. At unacceptable cost," the coalition voice replied. "Their hull integrity is compromised. Their crew is exhausted. And yet they continue, Keschel said. Because stopping would render the cost meaningless. The region yielded its secrets reluctantly. The far hand emerged scarred, its structural margins thinner than Marrow liked, but its databases richer. Patterns emerged in the chaos, hints of how the gradients formed, how they might be predicted or even exploited. Knowledge others had abandoned as too expensive now sat in human hands, incomplete but alive. That was when the first external threat manifested, and it did not come from the observers. The far hand's sensors detected a mass accelerating toward them on a vector that suggested intent. It was not broadcasting. Its profile did not match any known observer construct. Its energy signature was sharp, focused, predatory. Unknown vessel, Ansel said, his voice tight. Approach speed increasing, no response to hails. Marrow's mind snapped into a familiar clarity. Options. Evasion is possible but risky in our current condition, Ansel replied. Defensive measures are limited. We are not built for combat. Neither were we built for the fold, Marrow said. Open a channel to the observers, all of them. The response was fragmented. Confusion rippled through the shared space as different factions processed the new data. The unknown vessel was not part of their networks. Its origin lay deeper in the region, beyond the fold's influence, in volumes of space few had reason to traverse. A marauder, one observer suggested. A scavenger adapted to prey on isolated constructs. Why now? Keschel asked. Because they have been visible, the coalition voice said grimly, and because they are vulnerable. The implication hung heavy. Humanity's refusal of curation had exposed them, and perhaps others, to risks long kept at bay. Marrow did not wait for consensus. Transmit our sensor data, he ordered, all of it. And request assistance. Assistance did not come immediately. The observers' defense protocols were not designed for rapid intervention, especially not on behalf of an unintegrated species. The unknown vessel closed the distance with unsettling efficiency, its hull a sleek convergence of form and function that spoke of long refinement toward a singular purpose. They are scanning us, Ansel said. Targeting weak points. Then let us give them something unexpected, Marrow replied. The far hand powered up its engines to levels that made the hull scream in protest. Instead of fleeing directly, Marrow ordered a maneuver that took them deeper into the gravitationally unstable region they had just exited. It was a gamble born of familiarity. The humans had learned, painfully, how to read its chaos. The marauder had not. The pursuing vessel followed, confident in its superior design. Within moments, its trajectory faltered as the gradients caught it off guard. Its sleek hull, optimized for predictable environments, began to resonate dangerously. It attempted to compensate, but its responses lagged behind the region's shifting demands. Now, Marrow said, the far hand fired its limited defensive array, not to destroy, but to disrupt, targeting the marauder's stabilization systems. The shots were crude, inefficient, but timed with an intuition honed by lived experience. One struck true, and the marauder's control collapsed. The observers watched in stunned silence as the human ship, battered and limping, outmaneuvered a predator that by all conventional metrics should have dominated it. They used the environment, Tathran said softly. They turned a hazard into a weapon. The marauder did not explode. It tumbled, systems failing, drifting into a slower orbit around the chaotic gradients. The far hand did not pursue. Marrow ordered a halt, opening a channel. You are disabled, he transmitted. Cease hostile action. We will not fire again. There was no response, but the marauder's systems powered down further, a tacit acknowledgement of defeat. The observers erupted into debate. Some argued for immediate neutralization, citing the risk of future attacks. Others saw an opportunity for study, for understanding a threat long avoided rather than confronted. Marrow's next action surprised them all. He ordered a rescue team prepared. Captain, Ansel said carefully, that vessel attacked us. And now it is helpless, Marrow replied. If we let it die, we learn nothing except how to be feared. The boarding operation was perilous. conducted with minimal knowledge of the Marauder's biology or systems. The team moved slowly, adapting on the fly, using tools meant for ship repair to bypass alien architecture. They found survivors, injured but alive, their forms unfamiliar and their eyes reflecting a mix of aggression and confusion. They brought them aboard. The observers watched as humans extended care to a former enemy, allocating scarce medical resources to stabilize beings that had tried to kill them hours earlier. It defied several strategic doctrines at once. Why? The coalition voice demanded. This exposes them to further risk. Because mercy is also a form of intelligence, Keschel replied. It generates data. Tathrin considered the scene, its ancient perspective stretching across cycles of conflict and coexistence. They are not only adapting to the region, it said, they are adapting the region to themselves. In the aftermath, as the far hand repaired what it could and tended to the rescued survivors, the observers' internal calculus shifted. The humans were no longer just a variable to be contained or guided. They were an active force, capable of altering threat dynamics and moral expectations alike. The coalition's containment proposal fractured under the weight of new evidence. To isolate humanity now would be to forgo the benefits of their approach, benefits that had already manifested in the neutralization of a long-standing danger. The cool voice synthesized the emerging consensus. We cannot ignore them, it concluded, nor can we simply absorb them. They require a new category. On the far hand, Marrow stood in the medical bay, watching human and non-human medics work side by side, improvising shared protocols in real time. He felt the ache of exhaustion settle into his bones, but beneath it lay a steady resolve. Humanity had not come seeking dominance or approval. It had come seeking to continue, to learn, to endure. In doing so, it had forced an ancient region of space to confront the limits of its own assumptions. And this was only the beginning. The survivors from the Marauder vessel did not speak in ways the far hand's translators could immediately parse. Their communication relied on rapid shifts in electromagnetic fields across specialized organs embedded beneath layered carapace, a language closer to weather than to words. Human systems struggled to render it into anything coherent, and so the first understanding came not from dialogue, but from observation. They were afraid. Not in the explosive, reactive way humans often associated with fear, but in a compressed, coiled manner that suggested lives spent at the edge of annihilation. Their bodies bore scars both old and new, some clearly the result of internal failure rather than external conflict. Their vessel, once stripped of its predatory mystique, revealed itself as a study in brutal efficiency, systems cannibalized and reconfigured countless times to keep it functional in environments that devoured the unprepared. These are not raiders by choice, said Halron Voss, the Far Hand's chief xenobiologist, after hours spent watching the survivors' physiological responses. They are adapted to scarcity and threat. Predation is not a strategy for them, it is a condition. Marrow absorbed that in silence. He had seen the same truth reflected in human history often enough to recognize it in unfamiliar forms. Entire cultures shaped not by what they wanted to be, but by what the universe had forced them to become. The observers watched these developments with an intensity that bordered on discomfort. The rescue had already challenged their assumptions about human behavior, but the integration that followed cut deeper. The Far Hand did not isolate the survivors behind layers of containment. Precautions were taken, yes, but they were practical rather than punitive. The Marauder beings were treated as patients, not prisoners. They are extending trust without leverage, one observer noted. This is strategically unsound. It is strategically unfamiliar, Keschel replied. That does not make it unsound. Tathrin of Long Measure focused on the patterns emerging from the interaction. Humans adjusted their routines to accommodate alien needs, altering lighting cycles, electromagnetic emissions, even the chemical composition of the air in certain compartments. These changes were not optimal for human comfort, yet they were implemented without significant resistance. They deform themselves to fit others, Tathran said, not physically, but systemically. Is that sustainable? Asked the cool voice. That depends, Tathran replied, on whether the deformation is mutual. It did not take long for mutuality to appear. One of the Marauder survivors, designated by humans as Subject 3 until a more precise translation could be established, began to interact with the Far Hand's engineering staff. At first, the exchanges were limited to gesture and demonstration, but patterns emerged quickly. Subject 3 showed intense interest in the ship's structural patchwork, in the way incompatible components had been forced into cooperation. When Ansel realized what was happening, he called Marrow to the engineering deck. "It is mapping our failures," Ansel said, watching as Subject 3 traced a clawed appendage along a reinforced bulkhead, but not with contempt, with curiosity. Halran translated the alien's electromagnetic emissions as best he could. "It is asking why we did not discard this section when it failed." Marrow answered without hesitation. "Because discarding it would have meant discarding everyone behind it." The reply, when translated back into alien signaling, triggered a cascade of responses from Subject 3 that made Halran's instruments spike. "It finds that incomprehensible," Halran said slowly. "In its culture, sections that fail are sacrificed, entire crews sometimes." Ansel let out a slow breath. "That explains their ship." The realization reframed the encounter not as a clash between predator and prey, but between two philosophies of survival. One culled weakness to preserve function, the other reinforced weakness until it became strength, or at least endured long enough to matter. The observers could not ignore this exchange. Data from the Marauder vessel, shared reluctantly but thoroughly by the Far Hand, revealed a region of space far more hostile than the observers' own domains. There, resources were not merely scarce, but actively corrosive, environments that punished stability and rewarded only the most ruthless forms of adaptation. "These beings come from beyond our periphery," Keschel said. "They are refugees of a different kind of chaos, and now humans have inserted themselves into that equation," the Coalition voice said. "They attract danger. They also absorb it," Tathran replied, "and transform it." Transformation carried cost. The Far Hand's resources were strained, its crew operating on reduced rest cycles, its systems pushed to margins that would have been unacceptable in more controlled circumstances. Marrow felt the weight of every decision press harder as time wore on. He carried responsibility not just for his crew, but now for lives that had once sought to end them. The observers sensed this strain and for the first time acted without prompting. A channel opened, broader and more unified than any before it. The cool voice spoke, but it was layered now with the resonance of collective agreement. "You have demonstrated capacity under constraint," it conveyed. "You have altered threat dynamics in the region. Continued isolation of your species is no longer tenable." Marrow stood alone on the bridge when the message arrived, the stars beyond the viewport shifting slowly as the ship maintained its precarious equilibrium. "Then state your intent," he replied. "We propose integration," the voice said. "Limited, conditional, reciprocal." Marrow almost smiled. "That sounds like trust," he said. "It is risk management," came the response. "But the distinction may be academic. Integration began not with treaties or grand assemblies, but with infrastructure. The observers granted the Far Hand access to stabilized nodes where repairs could be conducted without the constant threat of environmental collapse. In return, they requested human participation in exploratory efforts beyond established safe zones, areas where their own methodologies had failed or stagnated. Humanity, through the Far Hand, agreed. The joint operations were messy, inefficient, and profoundly illuminating. Observer constructs struggled to function in regions where conditions changed too rapidly for predictive models to converge. Humans thrived there, not because they understood the chaos better, but because they accepted it as a given and focused on surviving the next moment. Conversely, in environments that demanded extreme precision and long-term stability, human systems faltered and observer technologies compensated. Each side found itself relying on the other in ways that eroded long-held assumptions of superiority. The coalition did not disappear, but its arguments softened. Containment was no longer feasible without losing access to insights humanity generated simply by existing in dangerous spaces. The cost-benefit analysis shifted, grudgingly but decisively. The Marauder survivors became an unexpected bridge between worlds. With improved translation, fragments of their history emerged. They called themselves something unpronounceable by human anatomy, a name that encoded lineage, territory, and loss. Their people had once been numerous, spread across a cluster of systems, now reduced to debris and radiation by phenomena similar to, but more violent than the Harath Fold. They had not fled by choice. They had fled because staying meant extinction. When Marrow heard this, he felt a familiar ache, an echo of humanity's own early expansions, when leaving Earth had been less about ambition and more about survival. The parallels were impossible to ignore. You do not have to return to what hunts you, he told Subject 3 through the halting but improving translation. You can stay or go somewhere else, but you do not have to be alone. The concept seemed to stun the alien. Its signaling patterns shifted into something Halrin tentatively labeled as disbelief. You offer shared risk, Halrin translated. Not protection, shared risk. Yes, Marrow said, that is all we ever offer. The observers took careful note of this exchange. Shared risk was not a foundational principle of their civilizations. Risk was something to be minimized, distributed, abstracted away from individuals wherever possible. Humans, by contrast, treated shared risk as a bond, a way to align disparate actors through mutual vulnerability. That is how they build coalitions, Keschel observed, not through dominance, but through exposure. And that may be more dangerous than force, the coalition voice replied quietly. The region around the Harath Fold began to change, subtly at first. Routes once avoided were tentatively explored with mixed crews and hybrid methodologies. Old danger zones were reclassified not as forbidden, but as conditional, their risks contextualized rather than erased. The presence of humans did not make space safer in an absolute sense. It made it more navigable. Not everyone welcomed this shift. Beyond the observer's primary domain, signals hinted at other powers taking notice. Distant intelligences, long content to let the fold serve as a barrier, now saw pathways opening, uncertainties propagating outward. Change, once initiated, had momentum. On the far hand, Marrow finally allowed himself a rare moment of rest. He sat alone in his quarters, listening to the familiar, uneven hum of a ship that had been pushed far beyond its intended purpose and kept going anyway. He thought of Earth, distant and abstract, and of the generations who might never know its gravity firsthand. Humanity had not arrived as conquerors or supplicants. It had arrived as a stress test. And the universe, it seemed, was beginning to respond. Far beyond the immediate region, forces stirred, drawn by the ripples of adaptation and shared risk. They would not all be benevolent, and they would not all be patient. But humanity had never depended on patience alone. It depended on the simple, relentless refusal to stop. The warning did not arrive as an alarm. It arrived as a discrepancy. Ansel Varric had learned to trust discrepancies more than confirmations. Confirmations told you that the universe was behaving as expected. Discrepancies told you that something new had entered the equation. When three independent sensor arrays disagreed on the background curvature of a distant sector by margins that should have been impossible under known conditions, he felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes. "Captain," he said, keeping his voice level, "we are seeing coordinated distortion far beyond local variance, not fold-related." Marrow-Kef straightened slowly from where he had been reviewing repair schedules, his attention sharpening. "Define coordinated." It is propagating, Ansel replied. Multiple vectors, same signature. Whatever it is not drifting. It is moving with intent. The observers detected it almost simultaneously, though their interpretation differed. Where human instruments framed the anomaly as a deviation from baseline physics, the observers recognized a pattern buried deep in historical data, something not seen in active form for longer than many of them had existed. Tathran of long measure stiffened, ancient patterns along its surface deepening abruptly. This is not a natural phenomenon, it communicated. This is an approach. Keschel responded with urgency rare for its kind. From where? From beyond negotiated space, came the reply layered with concern from multiple voices. From regions we do not monitor continuously, from entities that do not announce themselves. The coalition, fractured but not dissolved, reacted first with grim efficiency. They recognized the signature as well, though they named it differently, encoding fear into abstraction. They are returning, one voice said. The convergence architects. Marrow caught the translated term and frowned. That sounds like a title, not a species. That is because it is both, the cool voice replied. They are a distributed intelligence that reorganizes regions of space to eliminate variance. They do not conquer, they correct. Correct what? Marrow asked. Us, Keschel said softly. The far hand's bridge filled with a tension that went beyond immediate danger. This was not a marauder or a localized threat. This was something systemic, something that operated on scales that made individual survival strategies irrelevant. They erase instability, Ansel said, parsing the data as it evolved. By collapsing it, entire star systems, if necessary. And we are unstable, Marrow said, by definition. The observers had encountered the convergence architects before, long ago, when their own civilizations were younger and more prone to extremes. At that time, survival had depended on withdrawal, on hiding complexity behind layers of predictability until the architects moved on in search of more egregious variance. It had worked at a cost. Entire avenues of development had been abandoned. Entire forms of expression suppressed. Stability had been purchased with stagnation, and the observers had convinced themselves it was a necessary trade. Now, with humanity's arrival, those carefully flattened landscapes were rippling again. They will notice the changes, the coalition voice said. They will trace them back here. They already have, Tathran replied. This approach is deliberate. The observers faced a choice they had avoided for millennia. Hide again, retreat into predictability, sever the new pathways humanity had opened, or stand their ground and risk, attracting a force designed to remove precisely the kind of adaptive chaos humans embodied. Marrow listened, absorbing context at a pace that would have overwhelmed a less seasoned mind. If we withdraw, he said slowly, what happens to the regions we have already altered? They will be corrected, Keschel answered. That means collapse, sterilization, simplification. And if we stand, Marrow asked. The silence that followed was heavy. Then we must fight a force that does not think in terms of victory or defeat, the cool voice said. Only optimization. Marrow nodded once. Then we need to be unoptimizable. That concept rippled through the shared space, triggering analysis, counter-analysis, rejection, reconsideration. You cannot outmaneuver them conventionally, one observer argued. They adapt faster than predictive systems can compensate. Then do not be predictable, Marrow replied. Do not converge. Ansel leaned forward, eyes bright despite the strain. Captain, he said, they rely on pattern collapse. They reduce variance by enforcing uniform outcomes, but our systems are not uniform. They are inconsistent by design. Inconsistent systems are inefficient, Keschel said. They are resilient, Marrow countered. And more importantly, they do not fail the same way twice. The observers began to see it then, slowly and uneasily. Humanity's greatest weakness by their standards, the lack of clean optimization, the reliance on individual judgment and layered redundancy, might be the one thing the convergence architects could not easily assimilate. They would have to model us, Tathran said. in full, and that requires exposure, Ansel added, to edge cases, to irrational decisions, to sacrifice without statistical justification. The coalition voice bristled. You are proposing to weaponize instability. Yes, Marrow said simply, the same way we always do. Preparation began immediately, though it bore little resemblance to conventional military mobilization. There were no fleets to assemble, no lines to hold. Instead, the far hand became a node in a rapidly expanding network of shared data, human improvisation layered atop observer infrastructure. Routes were deliberately made messy, navigation solutions seeded with controlled unpredictability. Systems were modified to allow for rapid, localized decision-making rather than centralized control. Observer constructs, long accustomed to precision, struggled at first with the deliberate introduction of variance. This feels wrong, Keschel admitted during one exchange. We are unlearning habits that kept us alive. You are learning new ones, Marrow replied, ones that might keep you alive next time. The Marauder survivors played a crucial role. Their lived experience in corrosive regions provided insight into operating without reliable baselines. They taught humans and observers alike how to function when the environment itself punished consistency. Subject 3, now identified through improved translation as a lineage bearer rather than a simple crew member, communicated a warning that cut through layers of abstraction. They will try to simplify you, Halloran translated. They will offer stability. It will feel like relief. Do not accept it. Marrow felt a chill at that. You have faced them before. Subject 3's response was a burst of signaling so intense that Halloran had to dampen the interface. We lost ourselves, the translation rendered, not to death, to sameness. The convergence architects entered observable range as a distortion of probability rather than a fleet. Where they passed, outcomes narrowed, random fluctuations dampened, systems behaved more predictably, more efficiently, and then, abruptly, ceased to support complexity. Stars dimmed as fusion cycles were corrected into lower energy stability. Planetary systems lost chaotic resonances that supported life. Everything became quieter, simpler, wrong. They are beautiful, one observer murmured, unable to hide a trace of awe. They are death, Keschel replied. Marrow watched the data with a soldier's calm and a builder's anger. Then we make them choke on complexity. The first engagement was not a battle, but an intrusion. The architects extended optimization fields toward the outermost shared nodes, attempting to smooth the irregularities humans and observers had introduced. In response, the far hand and its allied constructs did something unprecedented. They changed, not uniformly, not efficiently. Each node responded differently, some amplifying noise, others introducing delays, others sacrificing function entirely to preserve unpredictability. Human crews made choices that made no sense in isolation, but disrupted the architects' attempts to model the system as a whole. They are failing to converge, Ansel said, disbelief creeping into his voice. Their corrections are overshooting. The architects adapted, as expected, tightening their parameters, increasing the scope of their optimization. But each adjustment encountered a different failure mode. There was no single pattern to eliminate, no stable attractor to collapse toward. Tathran felt something it had not felt in millennia, hope, fragile and sharp. They cannot simplify what refuses to align, it said. The cost was high. Systems failed, lives were lost. Entire constructs burned out under the strain of deliberate inefficiency. Humans absorbed the losses with grim familiarity, mourning without paralysis, repairing what could be repaired, abandoning what could not. The observers struggled more. Loss at this scale, especially loss chosen rather than imposed, cut against their deepest instincts. And yet they saw the alternative playing out in regions already touched by the architects, sterile and silent. The convergence architects began to withdraw, not in defeat, but in recalibration. The region had become too expensive to correct, too resistant to clean solutions. They will return, the coalition voice warned. with greater capacity. Yes, Marrow said. But now they know something they did not before. What is that? Keschel asked. That instability can be contagious, Marrow replied, and that not all problems want to be solved. As the distortion receded, leaving behind scars and gaps and survivors clinging to imperfect systems, the observers took stock of what had changed. They had not defeated the architects, but they had denied them resolution, and they had done so by embracing the very qualities they had once sought to suppress. Humanity, exhausted and battered, remained at the center of it, not as saviors, but as catalysts. The far hand drifted amid the aftermath, its hull a testament to damage survived and lessons learned at terrible cost. Marrow stood once more at the viewport, watching a star flicker back to life as chaotic variance reasserted itself. It was not beautiful in any classical sense. It was uneven, noisy, unpredictable. It was alive, and that, he knew, was worth defending. After the retreat of the Convergence architects, the region did not celebrate. There were no shared exultations, no declarations of victory carried across the observer networks. What remained instead was a reckoning, slow and unavoidable, settling into every system that had survived. Stability had not been restored. It had been irrevocably altered. The scars were everywhere. Entire observational lattices had burned out rather than align. Navigation corridors that had existed for tens of thousands of cycles were now unreliable, their predictive models shattered by deliberate divergence. Some habitats went dark, not destroyed, but disconnected, their caretakers choosing isolation over reintegration into a reality that no longer behaved as expected. The observers had endured catastrophe before. They had endured it by compressing, simplifying, narrowing their futures until survival fit neatly inside controllable parameters. This time, that instinct had been denied. Humanity had made sure of it. On the far hand, recovery was an exercise in triage stretched across weeks. The ship would never again be what it had been when it crossed the Harath fold. Its hull bore scars that could not be fully repaired with available materials, its internal layout altered by necessity rather than design. Entire decks had been sealed off permanently, turned into inert mass to stabilize more critical sections, and yet it functioned. Marrow-Kef walked the ship daily, a habit he had cultivated long before this journey. He spoke with crew members who had lost friends, who had made decisions that would haunt them, who had survived only because someone else had not. He did not offer platitudes. He listened. That, more than anything else, anchored the far hand's continued cohesion. In the medical bays, the Marauder survivors recovered alongside humans. The shared trauma of the confrontation with the architects had stripped away much of the remaining distance between them. Their people had been shaped by annihilation deferred. Now they had witnessed annihilation denied. Subject 3, no longer referred to by a numerical designation, spent long periods interfacing with human engineers and observer constructs alike. Translation had improved enough to carry nuance, and with it came something resembling reverence. You fought entropy without seeking to replace it, Subject 3 conveyed during one exchange. You did not become what hunted you. We have tried, Marrow replied. We do not always succeed. That may be why you still exist, Subject 3 said. The observers, for their part, convened the first true convergence in recorded history that did not aim to resolve differences. Instead, it catalogued them. Tathran of Longmeasure presided, its ancient form now etched so densely with recent patterning that it would take cycles to interpret. We must acknowledge, it communicated, that our previous survival strategies are insufficient for what comes next. The coalition voice responded, stripped of much of its former certainty. We survived by avoiding attention. That option is no longer available, nor is it desirable, Keschel added. Avoidance has made us brittle. The cool voice synthesized the emerging consensus, its tone altered by experience. We face a universe that corrects complexity by erasure. Our response has been to minimize complexity. Humanity has demonstrated an alternative. Mess, one observer muttered. Yes, Keschel agreed. Mess, interdependence, systems that break locally but endure globally. There was resistance, of course. Entire philosophical frameworks did not crumble overnight. Some observers argued that humanity's influence was a transient anomaly, that the convergence architects would adapt and return in overwhelming force, rendering all this effort moot. Others argued that humanity itself might become a similar force in time, spreading instability without restraint. Marrow was invited into this debate not as a subordinate voice, but as a necessary one. When he entered the shared space again, the weight of attention was heavier than before, layered with expectation and unease. "You have changed us," the collective conveyed. "We must decide what you are to us." Marrow did not posture. He did not frame humanity as indispensable or enlightened. He spoke as he always had, from the ground level of lived consequence. "We are not a solution," he said. "We are a condition. We introduce variability wherever we go. Sometimes that saves lives, sometimes it costs them. If you integrate with us, that will not stop. And if we do not," the coalition voice asked. "Then the universe will still change," Marrow replied. "You will just have less practice adapting to it." That answer lingered, not because it was persuasive rhetoric, but because it aligned too closely with recent experience to dismiss. The observers chose, at last, not unity but alignment. They would not become human. They would not abandon their methods wholesale, but they would no longer suppress divergence by default. Instead, they would cultivate controlled regions of unpredictability, spaces where adaptation could occur without threatening the entirety of their civilizations. They called these regions margins. Humans, unsurprisingly, volunteered to inhabit them. The far hand became the seed of something new, not a flagship or a capital, but a template. Hybrid stations were constructed near the fold, incorporating observer stability with human modularity and marauder resilience. They were not elegant. They were functional, and more importantly, they could fail without cascading collapse. Trade followed, not of material goods at first, but of methodology. Humans learned precision where it mattered. Observers learned improvisation where it was unavoidable. The marauder survivors taught both how to live when the universe itself seemed hostile to continuity. Beyond the immediate region, the ripples spread. Signals reached distant intelligences who had felt the architects, passing as a dimming of possibility, and now sensed its partial reversal. Some approached cautiously, others with suspicion, a few with opportunistic hunger. Not all encounters were peaceful. Humanity did not magically harmonize the cosmos, but it changed the terms. The convergence architects did return, years later by human reckoning, probing the altered region with increased capacity. They found not a unified resistance, but a shifting landscape of partial failures and stubborn survivals. Corrective incursions met systems that did not converge even under extreme pressure, systems willing to shed mass, function, even entire populations to deny resolution. The architects withdrew again, not defeated, but delayed, their optimization costs rising with each encounter. They began to avoid regions marked by human presence. That fact alone reshaped strategic thinking across multiple domains. Marrow Kef did not live to see all of this. He died aboard the Far Hand during a routine transit, his heart finally refusing to adapt one more time. His passing was quiet, marked by the same lack of ceremony that had defined his command. The observers recorded it nonetheless, embedding the event into shared memory not as a loss metric, but as a reference point. A human had stood at the intersection of ancient stability and emergent chaos and chosen neither dominance nor retreat. He had chosen continuation. The Far Hand did not retire. It could not. It had become too entangled with too many systems to simply stop. A new captain took command, then another, each inheriting not a pristine vessel, but a layered history of damage and repair that demanded humility. Humanity continued outward, not in a wave of conquest, but in uneven pulses, establishing footholds where others would not, inhabiting margins where prediction failed. They did not replace existing powers, they complicated them. And in doing so, they made space for others to exist as well. In later cycles, when observer scholars traced the inflection point that had led their civilizations away from terminal stagnation, they did not point to a battle or a treaty or a technological breakthrough. They pointed to a battered ship emerging sideways from an impossible fold, crewed by beings who treated survival not as a guarantee, but as a practice. Humans had not saved the region. They had taught it how to fail without ending. In a universe that corrected difference by erasure, that lesson proved harder to optimize away than any force the architects could deploy. The gravity of uncounted days continued to pull civilizations forward, unevenly, imperfectly, alive with noise and contradiction. And humanity, stubborn and fragile and endlessly adaptive, remained part of that pull, not because it was strongest, but because it refused to become simple.